The hedge ran for almost a mile along Long Furlong Lane, and on a gray October morning, it was doing something it had done every autumn for as long as anyone could remember, and nobody had noticed for at least 3 generations. It was dripping, not with rain, with berries. Small, dark red, faintly wrinkled berries, hanging in such thick clusters that the branches bowed under the weight. And where they'd already dropped, they lay in a rotting carpet along the verge, feeding nothing but the wasps and a resentful-looking blackbird. Bryony Chadwick stood in the mud in her father's spare Wellingtons, looked at several tons of free fruit going soft and brown for no reason at all, and said, out loud, to nobody, "Well, that's just criminal, that is." 3 weeks earlier, Bryony had been in London, in a flat she could no longer afford, watching the events company she'd sunk 2 years and most of her savings into fold quietly into administration, the way these things do, not with a bang, just an email at 11 p.m. and a lot of very calm language about unforeseen circumstances. She was 27, sharp-tongued in the specific way that comes from spending your 20s being underestimated by men in meetings. And she came home to Chadwick Farm with 1 suitcase and the settled conviction that this was a temporary stop, a place to lick her wounds before figuring out what came next. What she walked into was worse than her own collapse. Her father, Gareth Chadwick, 59, a man who could diagnose a tractor problem by sound alone, and had never once in Bryony's memory said the word feelings, met her at the gate, hugged her for exactly as long as was necessary, and not 1 second more, and told her, over tea, in the same flat tone he'd used to report a lame ewe, that he'd had a man from a developer round twice that month, and that the farm, 4 generations of Chadwicks, 210 acres of Herefordshire hedgerow and pasture, would very likely be sold by the end of the season. The bank had been patient. The bank was no longer patient. There was a number, and the number was bad, and the developer's number was good, and Gareth, who had spent 30 years fighting to keep the place standing, had run out of fight. Her mother, Marion, was handling it the way Marion handled everything, which was by being extremely, aggressively fine. She'd taken to hosting the WI coffee morning with slightly too much enthusiasm and slightly too many scones, and when Bryony caught her crying into the Aga one Tuesday and asked if she was all right, Marion said, "I'm absolutely fine, darling. I just don't think this pastry's going to crisp," in a voice that could have cut glass. There was, Bryony learned, a deadline, autumn's end. After that, the developer's offer came off the table, and the bank did what banks do. So there she was, 3 weeks later, standing in front of a hedge her father had been threatening to grub out with the digger for a decade. It's not earning its keep, Bry. It's just taking up a field's worth of land and giving me hell with the flail mower. And it was, in its useless, unwanted, thoroughly ignored way, absolutely groaning with fruit. She picked one, bit it. It was mealy, tart, faintly floury, with a big stone in the middle that made up most of the berry, and it tasted, she would say later, like a slightly annoyed apple, not delicious. But she had a half memory, from some school project, or possibly a National Trust tea room leaflet, of her great-grandmother making something out of hedge berries. Not jam. Something savory, a sauce. Haws. That's what they were called. Hawthorn berries. And somewhere in the back of her brain, next to the useless trivia she'd accumulated over a lifetime of half-reading things on the internet, was the fact that people used to make a spiced ketchup out of them. A proper old hedgerow recipe. Tangy and dark. The kind of thing that existed before every sauce in Britain came from a squeezy bottle with a smiling tomato on it. Everyone else's reaction to the hedge was to want it gone. Bryony's reaction, for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself, was to want to know what was in it. "You're going to do what with the hedge?" Gareth said, not so much a question as a statement of disbelief. "Make sauce out of it." "Right," he said, and went back to reading the parts catalog for the baler, in the manner of a man declining to engage further with his daughter's breakdown. Marion was, if anything, more alarmed. "People will see you in the ditch, Bryony. What will Reverend Hollis think?" I imagine he'll think I'm gathering berries, Mum, given that's what I'll be doing. He'll think we've gone peculiar. We are peculiar, Mum. We're about to lose the farm, and Dad's response was to buy a new part for a baler we might not own by December. Marion had no answer to that, which was, Bryony reflected, the most honest conversation they'd had in weeks. The village took the news the way the village took everything, loudly, and at the pub. "She's making sauce out of the hedge, Marion," announced Ted Boskin, 84, a permanent fixture at the corner of the bar at the Plough, who had opinions about everything, and standing to voice none of them. "The hedge. I've lived here 84 years, and I've never once thought, do you know what that hedge wants? It wants bottling." He took to needling her every evening she dared to walk past the pub window. "How's the posh weed sauce coming, love? Bottled any prestige yet?" This became, over the following weeks, something between a taunt and, eventually, a ritual she'd have been oddly disappointed to lose. She had no mentor, that was the honest truth of it. There was no wise old hedgerow woman waiting in a cottage to hand down ancestral wisdom. Her great-grandmother's notebook, if it had ever existed, was long gone. What she had was a laptop, a phone signal that came and went depending on which way the wind blew, and, at 2 in the morning when the isolation and the panic got specific, a forum called UK Forage and Preserve, populated by strangers with usernames like Slow But Steady and Pickle Priestess, who kept oddly generous hours and even odder opinions. Her first batch was a disaster, and it taught her the single most important lesson of the entire enterprise. Impatient and pleased with herself for having gathered 2 carrier bags of berries, she washed them, tipped the lot into the blender with some vinegar and sugar, and whizzed it into a thick reddish paste, stones, skins, and all. It looked promising. It tasted like bitter almonds and regret, and it left a strange, faintly chemical burn at the back of her throat. She posted about it at midnight, more out of despair than expectation of a reply, and got one within 4 minutes from a user called Hedgerow Hall, whose entire forum history consisted of terse, slightly irritable, extremely accurate advice. "You crushed the stones," he wrote. "Don't ever do that again. Haw stones, like apple pips and cherry stones, have cyanogenic compounds in them, same family. Won't kill you from one taste, but you do not want to be routinely liberating that stuff into a sauce you're planning to sell to the general public. Simmer the whole berries soft, then push through a sieve or a food mill. Pulp goes forward. Stones and skins get left behind. Every time. No exceptions. That's not a style choice. That's the whole game." Bryony read it twice, then typed back, "So basically I made poison sauce." "You made a bad decision, sauce," Hal replied. "Poison's for people who don't fix it. Fix it." She fixed it. She learned to simmer the haws, a pound or 2 at a time, in a pan of water just enough to cover them, for about 40 minutes, until they collapsed soft, and then force the pulp through a food mill, the kind with a hand crank and a fine mesh disc, so that the deep red flesh squeezed through and the hard little stones and papery skins stayed behind in a dry, spent little heap. It was slow. It was, for the volume of berries she was getting through, almost comically inefficient. She worked out, with something close to despair, that it took roughly 8 to 10 pounds of haws, an entire carrier bag, to yield about 1.5 pints of usable pulp, because so much of each berry was stone. "That's the trade," Hal told her, when she complained. "Wild hedgerow fruit doesn't care about your labor costs. You're not buying it from a supplier who bred it plump. You're taking what the hedge decided to grow." Her second failure was subtler, and nearly did real damage. She'd made a batch that tasted, by her own admittedly biased judgment, rather good. Dark, tangy, warmly spiced with a bit of ginger and allspice she'd found at the back of Marion's cupboard, and she'd potted it up in old jam jars and put a few by, pleased with herself, only to find 3 weeks later that the surface of one jar had a faint white bloom and a smell that made her recoil. This time it was a user called ph.pedant.cas, only ever appears to correct people's pH, as Hal put it dismissively in the same thread, which did not stop Colin appearing, who laid it out for her in a reply longer than her original post. Ketchups and sauces of this kind rely on acidity for both flavor and safety. You need enough vinegar, by volume, to bring the whole mixture down to a pH of around 4.6 or lower, to reliably prevent the growth of things like botulism-forming bacteria in a sealed jar, and low-acid fruit like haws don't get you there on their own. If you're eyeballing your vinegar, instead of measuring it as a fixed proportion of the batch, you are gambling, not cooking. Get a testing strip. Better yet, get a bit of proper kit and check it every batch, not just the first one. She had, in fact, been eyeballing it, on the grounds that it tasted better with a bit less bite. That vanity nearly killed a customer she didn't have yet. She bought pH strips the next day from an online shop that also sold beekeeping equipment, for reasons she never established, and after that she measured her vinegar like a woman diffusing something. Her third failure came earlier in the process, before she even got to the pan, and it was about patience of a different kind. Eager to get started before she'd fully worked out the safety side, she'd stripped a hedge of berries in mid-September, weeks before they were properly ready, and made a batch that came out gray-brown, mouth-puckeringly astringent, and mealy, in a way no amount of sugar could fix. Haws aren't ready till after the first frost, generally, offered a cheerful voice on the forum. One Jamgran92, a retired dinner lady from somewhere in the Midlands, who posted almost exclusively in exclamation marks, and had opinions on every single thing Bryony tried. Same as sloes, love. Wait till they've had a proper nip of cold. They go a deeper red and softer, and all that bitterness calms right down. Patience is a virtue, my Nan used to say, mostly to me, because I never had any. Bryony waited. It was, she reported to the forum, the longest 3 weeks of my life, made longer by the fact that my ram was actively trying to sabotage the project. The ram deserves proper introduction. Bramble had come to the farm 4 years earlier as an orphaned lamb Bryony had bottle-fed by hand every 4 hours through a cold march, and the result of that intensive early relationship was a fully grown ram who had never once accepted that he was, in fact, livestock, and not the landowner. Bramble headbutted the postman on a weekly basis. Bramble headbutted the metal gate to the top field so regularly that it had a permanent dent shaped more or less like his forehead. Bramble headbutted a wheelbarrow once for reasons nobody could reconstruct. He treated any open door as an invitation, and had been found in the farmhouse kitchen no fewer than 11 times, on one occasion having eaten an entire pound of butter directly off the worktop. The moment Bryony began laying haws out on trays to air a little before simmering them, Bramble discovered a previously untapped passion for foraged hedgerow fruit. He ate them off the drying racks faster than she could gather replacements, standing there with a look of magnificent, wounded innocence, as though the whole enterprise were somehow being conducted at his expense rather than the reverse. "I am trying to save the farm, Bramble," she told him, on more than one occasion, "and you are eating the evidence." Bramble, unmoved, continued eating the evidence. By late October, with frost properly on the ground and the berries at their deep, soft, ready red, she had a recipe that worked. Haws simmered soft, milled to pulp, cooked down slowly, with malt vinegar measured properly, and checked with a strip until it tested safely acidic, dark muscovado sugar, salt, and a warm blend of spices. Allspice, cloves, a little ginger, a bay leaf simmered in and removed, reduced until it was thick, glossy, almost black-red, somewhere between a brown sauce and a chutney, with a tang that hit first and a slow, warm spice that followed. She called it, with the kind of bluntness that would define the whole brand, Chadwick's Hedgerow Haw Ketchup. The first sale was almost an accident. Nita Sharma, who ran a farm shop deli called the Green Larder 2 villages over, had known Marion for years through the church flower rota, and agreed, mostly as a favor, to take 6 jars on a sale or return basis, tucked onto a shelf between a fancy chili jam and some pickled walnuts nobody ever bought. They were gone in 4 days. Nita rang and asked for 2 dozen more. I don't have 2 dozen jars of Haws, Bryony said, doing a swift, grim inventory of her supply of both fruit and thyme. I have possibly enough Hedge for 2 dozen jars. I do not have enough hours in a day. She hired help. Cass Marrow, 17, recently left school with no fixed plan and a flat refusal to be talked down to, who turned out to have a genuinely excellent eye for a ripe berry, and even less patience than Bryony for anyone who doubted the whole business, including, occasionally, Ted Boskin, whom she once told to get a hobby that isn't me, in front of half the pub. Nita took a photograph of a jar on her shelf with a handwritten label, posted it with the line, "The girl saving her family farm with hedge sauce," and it did the thing that these things occasionally, unpredictably, do. It moved. Shared, reshared, picked up by a regional paper, then a food blog, then a slightly larger food blog. Orders started arriving by email from people who had never been anywhere near Herefordshire. A wholesaler asked about stocking terms. A very small regional supermarket chain, Wayford's, got in touch about a possible listing across 11 of its stores. An order that Gareth worked out with his old kitchen table calculator, one evening, in a silence so heavy Bryony could hear the clock, would very nearly clear what the farm owed the bank, right on the deadline. For about 10 days, life at Chadwick Farm felt, for the first time in months, like it might actually work out. Then Piers Wenlock turned up. Piers Wenlock owned Fern Hollow Fine Foods, a condiment company with a barn conversion office, a design budget, and a knack for spotting a trend 2 weeks before it broke, and being first to shelf with a version that cost a third as much to make. He had, it emerged, seen the same viral post everyone else had, and within 3 weeks, an impossible speed for anyone actually simmering and milling real hawthorn berries by hand, which was rather the point. Fern Hollow's Hedgerow Haw Ketchup appeared in shops with a rustic-looking label, a soft launch discount, and a shelf price undercutting Bryony's by almost half. He can't have picked, cooked, and bottled real Haws in 3 weeks, Bryony said, staring at a jar Nita had brought her out of pure professional curiosity. There aren't enough hours. There isn't enough Hedge. There weren't. Fern Hollow's version, it would later transpire, was mostly apple concentrate, sugar, coloring, and a whisper, a genuinely tiny percentage, of actual hawthorn extract, enough to let them print the word on the label without, strictly, lying. It didn't matter. Not at first. It looked similar. It was cheaper. And 2 days before the Wayford's contract was due to be signed, Piers Wenlock's sales team got there first, offering a bigger volume at a lower price, and Wayford's, a business, not a charity, took it. Gareth took the news the way Gareth took everything, quietly, but Bryony saw something in his face that frightened her more than shouting would have. He looked like a man who had allowed himself, briefly, to hope, and was now putting the hope away again, carefully, like something he didn't expect to need for a while. "We had it," he said. "We had it, and it's gone." There were, by Bryony's count, 6 weeks left before the deadline. The debt that Wayford's order would have covered still sat there, unmoved, indifferent to how hard anyone had tried. Orders that had been building steadily began, within days, to slow, as shops that stocked both quietly favored the cheaper option. It was, by any reasonable measure, over. She sat up at 2 in the morning, old habit by now, and typed into the forum, with none of her usual dryness, just the flat facts of it. "They've undercut us. They've taken the order that would have saved the farm. I don't know what to do." The replies came in from 3 time zones, as they always did. Jamgran92 sent hearts and told her not to give up, in more exclamation marks than the situation strictly warranted, but with a warmth that helped anyway. Colin sent, unhelpfully but not unkindly, a breakdown of typical apple concentrate costs versus real hawthorn processing costs, which at least explained precisely how Wenlock had done it. Hedgerow Hal sent 4 words. "Theirs is a fake, prove it." Proving it took a stranger to the whole thing. Rowena Ash, a food writer with a reputation for not caring whose feelings she hurt, who had picked up the story from the same viral thread and, out of professional nosiness, ordered both jars side by side. She wrote, in a piece that ran in a national paper's food section and was shared several thousand times within a day, that Fern Hollow's version was an empty jar of marketing, thin, oversweet, artificially tinted, containing so little actual Hawthorn that the name amounts to false advertising in spirit, if not quite in law, and that Chadwick's original was everything a proper hedgerow ketchup should be: dark, tart, warmly spiced, made by someone who clearly picked every berry herself, and worth every penny of the difference. It was the kind of piece that changes things overnight, and it did. Wayford's buyer rang within 48 hours, faintly embarrassed, to say they'd like to revisit the contract. Orders that had slowed began arriving in numbers Bryony hadn't seen even at the height of the first viral wave. First from around the country, then, astonishingly, from abroad, as the story traveled further than the sauce ever had. Piers Wenlock, to his credit, or perhaps simply his arrogance, did not slink away. He drove out to Chadwick Farm himself, in a car worth more than the farm's tractor, to make what he clearly believed was a generous offer: buy out the Chadwick name and recipe, fold it into Fern Hollow, keep Bryony on in some vague consulting capacity, and let him handle scaling it properly. He was halfway through his pitch, standing by the yard gate in a coat that had never once been rained on, when Bramble, who had spent 4 years perfecting his read of exactly which humans were, in his professional opinion, up to no good, put his head down and hit him square in the backside hard enough to send him 2 feet into a puddle that Bryony would later insist, with a completely straight face, was mostly rainwater. "I think that's a no from the farm," Bryony said, not moving to help him up. Piers Wenlock did not come back. The Wayford's contract was signed the following week, on terms rather better than the original, and it landed, with almost theatrical timing, 12 days before the deadline. Gareth read the final figures at the kitchen table 3 times before he said anything, and what he said was, "Well, that's that hedge earning its keep then," which from Gareth, Chadwick was roughly equivalent to another man weeping with joy. The farm was saved. Not comfortably, not lavishly, but saved. The debt cleared, the developer's man sent away with a politeness Marion insisted on, and Bryony resented having to muster, the 210 acres staying exactly where they'd been for 4 generations. The hedges that Gareth had spent a decade wanting to grub out became, within a single season, the most valuable acreage on the farm, harvested every autumn now with a proper rota, clean stretches well back from the road, where the exhaust and spray drift wouldn't taint the fruit, Cass and 2 more hired hands working the milling shed that used to be the old dairy. The village came around with the specific, shameless speed of villages everywhere. Ted Boskin took to telling anyone who'd listen that he'd always said that Hedge had something in it, a claim flatly contradicted by roughly 18 months of him saying the exact opposite at volume in a public house. Marion told the story at church now, with no embarrassment whatsoever, adding new, flattering details each time, until in her telling, she had apparently suggested the whole idea herself. Rowena Ash got a jar in the post with a handwritten thank you. So did Nita and Cass, and, at Bryony's insistence over some initial pushback about the postage to Wisconsin, Hedgerow Hal, Jamgran 92, and Colin, none of whom she had ever met in person, and all of whom she now considered, without much argument from anyone, family of a sort. Hal's reply, when the jar arrived, was characteristically short. Good batch. Vinegar's right. From him, that was practically a hug. Bramble continued to headbutt anyone he took a dislike to, on a schedule known only to himself, and remained under the sincere impression that he owned the farm, the Hedges, the Ketchup business, and, quite possibly, the county. Nobody saw much point in arguing with him. He had, after all, earned it. If there's a weed or a bit of waste in your life that somebody's told you is worthless, tell us about it in the comments. And if you like this one, like and subscribe, because there are plenty more people out there who turn somebody's trash into a living. There was, in the weeks after the Wayford's contract landed, a strange new problem to have, which was that Bryony Chadwick now had to think seriously about scale, a word she had never once applied to herself before that autumn. The milling shed, converted from the old dairy, with a bit of second-hand stainless steel, and a great deal of Gareth's grudging carpentry, could handle a certain volume and no more, and the hedges themselves, however loaded they looked to the eye, had a real ceiling on what they could give. Hal was blunt about it, as he was about everything. "You can't grow a hedge faster by wanting it to," he wrote, when she asked about expanding into a neighboring farm's overgrown boundary lines. "Wild fruit gives what it gives. Don't let the orders talk you into cutting corners on the ripening, or the vinegar just to hit a number. That's exactly what got Wenlock caught out." She took the advice the way she'd learned to take all of his advice, which was as gospel dressed up as bad temper. So instead of chasing every order at any cost, she did the unglamorous sensible thing. She planted more hawthorn, deliberately, along field margins that had never had a hedge at all, laid out properly with a hedge layer Gareth found through an old contact, so that in 10 or 15 years there would be new ground coming into bearing, just as the old hedges were managed on a proper rotation, cut and allowed to regrow in sections, so no single year stripped the plant bare. It was, Gareth observed, the first time in living memory that a Chadwick had planted a hedge on purpose, rather than simply failing to get round to removing one, and he said this with the particular dry satisfaction of a man watching an argument he'd been having with the land for 30 years finally resolve itself in his favor. Marion, for her part, became the unofficial face of the operation at every village event going, handing out samples on a little folding table at the church fete with the vicar's blessing and, eventually, his enthusiastic personal endorsement, delivered from the pulpit in a sermon about the value of things the world overlooks, which Bryony privately considered a bit much but did not have the heart to object to, since her mother had clearly been waiting her entire adult life to be the interesting one at coffee morning. By the following autumn, the jars carried a small printed line on the back: "Foraged and made on the farm where it grows, 4 generations, no shortcuts." And orders came in from places on the map Bryony had to look up, and every single one of them still started with the same 10 pounds of berries, yielding the same stubbornly modest pint and a half of pulp, the same slow simmer, the same careful strip of paper dipped to check the acid was where it needed to be. The hedge had not gotten any more generous. She had simply learned, properly, how to ask it for what it had. If there's a weed or a bit of waste in your life that somebody's told you is worthless, tell us about it in the comments. And if you like this one, like and subscribe, because there are plenty more people out there who turn somebody's trash into a living.